Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Paul from the Larson Public Library. Also like to introduce Veronica, who's a library trainee, who's also here to help us tonight. Thanks, Veronica. And I'd like to welcome Christina Baal, who did an amazing trip to the Galapagos Islands and is going to tell us all about it. Thanks for joining us, Christina. Take it away.
All right, well, thank you, Paul. I'd like to thank the Larchmont Library for having me tonight, and this is an amazing opportunity. I know we've all been, stuck inside, and we've had a lot of COVID everywhere, so I'm really excited that I have a chance to help you fantasize about the world opening back up and some of the amazing things that are out there, and we can go experience now that it's getting warmer, albeit a little bit too warm this week, but getting warmer, and it's almost summer, and we can finally move around again. So I'm going to jump into my PowerPoint here. I'm going to share my screen because the Galapagos needs pictures. All righty, now let me just get to the slideshow start. Sorry, let me move this over here. All righty. And now we shall begin. So, the Galapagos are a truly incredible place. And in 2017, I was fortunate enough to win the lottery in my 20s when I had a colleague who very unfortunately had a medical issue that she found out about 10 days before her trip to the Galapagos. And unfortunately, she did not have trip insurance. So she was very kind, very generous. And instead of just giving up the trip and losing it, she offered it to me since I was one of the only people she knew who could just like suddenly turn around and go to the Galapagos in 10 days. I work at Sheldrake Environmental Center over in Larchmont. And when I asked them about the trip, very fortunate for me, they said, yes, this is a great opportunity. Just go, we'll figure it out. And so off I went to the Galapagos. And I hope that if you take away anything from this talk tonight, aside from how amazing the wildlife of the Galapagos is that you should always have trip insurance for expensive trips. All right, so let's head out on our adventure. Whoops. All right, so welcome to the Galapagos, Las Islas Encantadas. So in 1574, a gentleman by the name of Abraham Ostelier, he set foot in the Galapagos and noticed that there were these really interesting tortoises, these giant tortoises all over the islands. And they had these saddleback shaped shells. And in Spanish, the word for that saddleback is Galapago. So he gave the name, he dubbed the islands the Galapagos Islands. And so now these islands are named after the giant tortoises that are a very iconic part of the islands, and you can actually see all around the islands. So just to locate us geographically, the Galapagos Islands are a 21 island archipelago. You can see in the top left corner all the islands. They are very different sizes. Some of them are much larger than others. And if you look down in the bottom right corner at that picture, you'll see that these islands are all off the coast of South America in the Pacific Ocean. Politically, the Galapagos Islands belong to Ecuador, which has been a very beneficial affiliations because Ecuador is a neutral country. So the Galapagos have never had to worry about being a point of contention between other nations. They can just stay there in the Pacific Ocean and do their Galapagos thing. You'll notice that the Galapagos Islands are pretty far off the mainland, either from Central or South America. And this location is very important in terms of the unique features of the Galapagos. So most travelers who embark to the Galapagos leave from Quito, the capital of Ecuador, and that is a 620-mile trip. Metaphorically speaking, the Galapagos are this little oasis in a nutrient desert that is the Pacific Ocean. The Galapagos, on the other hand, are a nutrient-rich archipelago because they are volcanic. That volcanic activity gives them this incredible source of nutrients. And because they are volcanic, these islands are completely formed by volcanoes. They are still evolving, changing. There's still volcanic activity. These islands have never separated from a continental plate. And because of that, they are their own completely isolated ecosystem. They are still changing and evolving as we speak. And there's nothing else out there that really influences their development, except for the fact that people now go to the Galapagos. Aside from that, they are completely self-contained. It's incredible. And you can see from these pictures here that the landscape is still very young, very rough, very jagged. It looks like something you might imagine from the times of dinosaurs. It's just it's very fierce, very harsh, but incredibly beautiful. Until 1535, fun fact, no one really knew if the Galapagos existed. The currents surrounding the islands are so fierce that sailors back in the day, without more technological navigational advances, were not actually able to get to the islands without great difficulty. And it seemed as though the islands were moving. And on top of that, the Galapagos experienced a phenomenon called the Garua. From June to November of every year, heavy mist, fog, and drizzle surround the islands to the point where sometimes they seem to disappear. So these poor sailors, either the islands were moving or the islands were disappearing. Basically, they were these bewitched, enchanted islands, Las Islas Encantadas. It wasn't until 1535 that the Bishop of Panama at the time finally set foot on the island, documented his arrival, and proved that these islands really did exist. And interestingly, one of the first things he noticed was the tameness of the animals. And it is, of course, that those animals and the tameness of them, the fact that they are so easy to study, that has allowed the Galapagos to go down in scientific history as the birthplace of one of the most important schools of scientific thought was developed here. And that is, of course, the theory of natural selection put forth by Charles Darwin after his research here on the Galapagos Islands. So in 1835, a young Darwin embarked on the Voyage of the Beagle, which is a fantastic book, and you should check it out from the library after this is over. He came to the Galapagos, not really knowing what to expect, but he discovered this incredible laboratory of these very unique situation he stumbled upon, because there were all these different islands inhabited by animals that looked very similar, but exhibited very subtle, but very important physical differences. So, the one that everyone knows is most familiar with, the beaks of the finches. I definitely remember doing some kind of science lab in 8th grade about the beaks of the finches. The finches are the biggest one, but they're also mockingbirds, the tortoises. Depending on the island, Darwin noticed that each of the finches had developed a slight variation in their beak. And he continued to watch them and noticed that the reason that these beaks were so, interesting was because each bird was able to take advantage of a different ecological niche, that food source that was available on that particular island, and was able to be most easily accessed by the bird with the right shaped beak to get at that food. And Darwin posited this idea that random genetic mutations occurred within these species of birds, and the ones that experienced those mutations, the ones that allowed for these differently shaped beaks to develop and give them an advantage on that food source, would be the genes that were passed on to future generations of birds. And this is, of course, how we came to the idea of evolution through these finches. And then in 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species, setting forth this idea of evolution, forever changing the course of science as we know it. So back in the day, there were about 14 finches that were identified. We're still continuing to make advances in evolutionary sciences. So now there are 18 different documented finches. Some are so common and proliferous that you get to the airport in the Galapagos and they immediately come to eat your food. There were a bunch of cactus finches that just were hanging around the tourists' feet. There are other finches like the mangrove finch. There are less than 100 individuals left in the whole world. It's one of the rarest birds in the whole world. And that bird has so specialized in those mangrove swamps that it is like just hanging over the edge of extinction. All right, so we're going to move on. The climate of the Galapagos. The unique climate of the Galapagos is a very big part of what makes it the living laboratory that it is. So the Galapagos is at the crux of three pivotal currents. We have the Cromwell current, coming in from the west going east. This is a cold current. It makes the western side of the islands very cold. And I can assure you that is very cold. I was wearing a very thick wetsuit when I jumped in, and I still screamed because it was unbelievably frigid. And had it not been a once in a lifetime opportunity, I would have jumped right back in the boat and said, forget it, freezing. We then have water from the Humboldt currents coming out from the south. That water actually comes out of the Antarctic Ocean. It is also frigidly cold. However, it brings in so many nutrients that then support this incredible ecosystem of living things in the maritime area around the islands. And these are the two currents that are responsible for the dry climate that is between June and November. If you ever decide you want to visit the Galapagos, I recommend going during this time because after that, the southeastern trade winds reside and then El Nino current flows in from the north east, it flows down, and that brings hot, heavy, humid climate. This is the rainy season. It revitalizes all the shrubs. You can see in these two pictures, the top one is the time of year when it is hot, humid, and heavy, but there's a lot of green. And then the dry season from June to November is underneath, when everything is very barren, but it's not raining every day. All right, so as I alluded to earlier, the Galapagos Islands are all volcanic, and in the scope of geologic time, they are essentially infants. Most of them are less than 1 million years old, which in geologic time is essentially a sneeze. The youngest islands are only, and those are on the east side. The Eastern Islands are the youngest ones. They are still less than 1 million years old. They are 0.7 million years old, which is nothing. The oldest islands on the western side of the archipelago are only 3.2 million years old, still very young, but just a little bit older. And the interesting thing is that as you go from island to island, from east to west, you can actually see the process of primary succession taking place, because these islands are still, some parts of the islands are still cooling off from the volcanic eruptions that created them. So in these top row of pictures here, I put some examples of some of the islands that are still so young that they are essentially moonscapes. There are two main types of lava rock formations across the younger Galapagos Islands, and the two types of lava are called A'a and Pahuihui. And the A'a is rock that cooled really, really, really fast, and because of that is very, very jagged and rough. And the reason it's called A'a is because you walk on it with bare feet, you will be saying A'a because it really, really hurts. The Pahuihui is lava that cooled at a much slower rate, and gas was trapped within it. And so because of that, it sort of reminds me of if you had like a chocolate fondue and the chocolate just kind of pools slowly over the edge of your dessert. You can see in the middle picture here, those ripples from where the lava just slowly moved out, radiated from where it was from the eruption, and then cooled in these ropey, ripply patterns. And the picture on the far left, that is a really iconic rock formation in the Galapagos. It is Kicker Rock. And that is rock that is still so new and so unstable that it just sort of falls off. It just like cleaves off the sides of the island, forming these huge splits in the rock. It's really cool. So in the bottom row of pictures, these are a couple examples of the vegetation that is colonizing the islands. Like I said, they're still so young that the only things that are really growing in terms of plant life are primary successors. So on the right side, you see this lava cactus. That is a species that's endemic to the Galapagos. In the middle one, I have an example of an island that's more of a middle-aged island. It has some grasses, some shrubs, very, very small trees, but still it's very barren. And on the right side, that is an island that has actually been, there are people who live on that particular island, Santa Cruz. And because human influence has brought more water, and there's just more, that's an older island, there's more vegetation. You can actually see that the whole ground is covered with greenery, and then there are more shrubs and even some human plants. They do grow fruits and other smaller trees on the islands inhabited like humans. But overall, it's a really interesting thing to be in a place where there's just so little vegetation, because it's still just so new. I imagine this is what going to outer space must be like, minus all the animals. Okay, the last big topic I want to get into before we head into the main event, the wildlife, is the humans and conservation aspect of the Galapagos. So now, while there is of course a story, the wildlife have a story, there is also a human story in the Galapagos as well. In 1807, the first official resident of the Galapagos was documented, Patrick Watkins. He created the first post office, which was essentially this little box where sailors would leave their mail. And then when another boat came by, they would take out the mail, take it with them, and then leave their own mail. And this is actually a very low budget tradition that still remains in the Galapagos. Tourists will leave postcards in there and then flip through postcards that other tourists have left and see if there's anyone who lives near them, and then take the postcards and hand deliver them when they get back home, which I think is kind of cool. You know, we're living the post office job right there. I never got my postcards, so I'm just going to assume one day I'll get it. It's still out there. But anyway, aside from this, Ecuador did eventually in the 19th century, after Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859, Ecuador eventually realized the importance of the islands in the 1930s. Unfortunately, World War II then occurred, and then that was sort of put on the back burner. The United States built a military base on the island of Baltra, which is now part of the airport. And then at that point, the Galapagos Island was in danger of becoming a political player on the world stage just because of its position in the Pacific theater of that war. But fortunately, the war ended. The Galapagos was returned to its role as just an ecological, scientifically ecological role. And then by the end of the 20th century, Ecuador had established the Charles Darwin Scientific Institute and turned most of the islands into a national park. So today, 95% of the Galapagos Island, the land encompassing the all 21 islands, is an official national park. However, there are also small towns that exist in the Galapagos Islands. Santa Cruz and Floriana have towns. Tourism has brought people to the Galapagos. Nowadays, at least 200,000 tourists come through a year. Obviously, this is pre-COVID. At about 40, and back in 2014, which is the most recent data that I have in terms of a census, about 40,000 people lived in the Galapagos. And unfortunately, most of the Galapagos is very much a third world country situation. There's a lot of poverty. The only money really to be made is in fishing and in tourism. There are great examples of partnerships between the national park and the locals. For instance, local guides are trained to work with the tourists, and they actually go on and become really well paid, and they work a lot with the scientists, which is great. But unfortunately, you have to pay to get into the national park, and locals are not, or at least back when I went in 2017, locals were not excused from this fee, which is absolutely untenable for most of the people who live there. So most of the people who live on the islands can't even get in to most of the land in which they live, except for on special occasions when the park offers free days to locals. So there's this huge conflict between the locals who live on the islands and then the actual park itself and this conservation efforts. And then of course, there's other problems too. I mean, the fishing industry is very strong and a great opportunity for economic growth. But there was, for instance, one time when the fishermen were over harvesting sea cucumbers, one particular instance there. And because of this, the national park had to step in and say, no more fishing the cucumbers. And the fishermen rioted because that was their way of life. That was in direct conflict with the goals of the national park. So situations like this arise all the time. There have to be, it's continually developing this because, more and more people continue to expand in the Galapagos. So this balance between conservation and balancing the needs of its inhabitants, its human inhabitants, is a very fine tightrope to be walked. And the last thing I'll say in terms of the human wildlife relationship is that, before humans came to the Galapagos, it was completely isolated. But as humans came, inevitably, they brought visitors, animal visitors. So because of humans, cats, rats, goats have come to the Galapagos and wreaked havoc on the ecosystem. Fortunately, major conservation efforts have eliminated most of the goats. However, the rats and the cats, as well as other invasives we may not even know about, remain a huge problem and a huge threat for the endemic wildlife, the local wildlife. So that is constantly a battle that is being fought. When I went to the Galapagos, all of our bags were fumigated within the air while we were still in the aircraft. We were fumigated again when we got off the airplane. And we had to walk on this special, it was almost like AstroTurf surface to make sure that the bottom of our shoes wasn't carrying any dirt from mainland Ecuador. So they take that very, very seriously, but it's still a constant threat. Humans are going to change the Galapagos. So, we have to balance, how much we can do by being there, conducting science and having conservation, but then also every time we go there, there's that threat that we could set this very tightly balanced ecosystem off balance. All right, so this picture I particularly thought was powerful because you have this, this is the remains from one of the goats that was once at one point endemic, let me try again. That was at one point one of those invasive species wreaking havoc. And so there's all these little bits of evidence, even though they try to keep the park pristine, that humans were here and they're leaving evidence behind that we are no longer, that the Galapagos is no longer this contained ecosystem. All right, so the main events. When people think of the Galapagos, they think of the Galapagos because of Darwin's finches and because of all the incredible wildlife that lives in the Galapagos. And I have to say, for me, this is the most exciting part because, you know, I love animals, love birds, and the Galapagos has some of the most incredible birds and wildlife you can possibly find. Has some of the highest rates of endemic species of anywhere in the world. And by that, I mean that there are so many species here that you cannot find anywhere else. So if you really want to see some really cool things, you have to go and see it there because you just can't get it anywhere else. And then, of course, the interesting thing about the Galapagos is every animal that lives here, you know, as I said in the beginning, they're 620 miles from the mainland, these islands. So if you're living in the Galapagos, that means you either flew, you swam, or you hitched a ride to get there, which has definitely played a role in what kinds of animals are most prevalent on the islands. So we're going to start off with mammals. And because, like I said, you have to swim, fly, hitch a ride, you know, a lot of mammals, land mammals particularly, flying and swimming is not an option. So the only land mammals in the Galapagos are a couple of rats that now are doing very poorly because of invasive rats, and a couple bats. So the mammals running the show in the Galapagos are marine mammals by far. And the two most iconic, most prevalent mammals are the Galapagos sea lion and the northern fur seal. So the Galapagos sea lion is by far the most numerous. It is the biggest, and it is just totally shameless and totally adapted to humans. They're on the docks in the harbors. They'll just come up to people and beg for food. When you're swimming in the water, they will totally fearlessly just come up and start swimming with you. They're quite amazing. The northern fur seal is a little bit of a different situation. There's far fewer of them because of their thick fur. They were actually in a lot of trouble for a while because sailors would harvest them for their fur. They also can't handle the hotter temperatures as well, and they reproduce a bit slower. So when their populations are hit by, sometimes they can get diseases, or the weather patterns can affect their breeding, then they just have fewer numbers in general. So they're a little harder to see, but they're still fairly common on islands with a lot of shade. And both seals are just so adorable, I have to say. I mean, just look at these guys. They just will lay out on the beach like a bunch of logs. I'll never forget getting off the boat and getting to the first island. We had to crawl up these rocks to get to the trail. And I stuck my head over the side, and there was a sea lion just sprawled out right there at eye level, just this big lump. It was amazing. And then, as you walk within the park, you're not allowed to get off the trail. There's a very strict trail you have to follow. And the sea lions, if they go in the trail, you just essentially have to step over them as they sleep. It's hilarious. And then the other cool thing is every part of the park, both the land and the maritime sections of the park, you can explore both of them. So I got to do some snorkeling. Visitors can do some snorkeling. And then the sea lions will come right up and swim with you in this incredible underwater world. So this is a little video. Now, I'm not a videographer, so just, hold on to your hats if you get dizzy, because the sea lion does swim around quite fast. But this is just a little video I wanted to share to sort of try to give you that experience of what it's like to be in the water and have this sea lion just swimming all around you. So fast. He was right there. It's like one of those dinky underwater cameras. Isn't that just wild? And then at one point he came and gave me an actual nose boop. I thought I was gonna faint. It was so cute. And then so the underwater wildlife is like an entire other world, and it's so colorful. There's fish and octopus. I put a picture of one of those sea cucumbers I mentioned. They're still here. They were able to bring them back a little bit. That Mexican bumpfish just was had this incredible bump on its head. And a lot of these fish just don't care about anything. They'll just swim right up to you. Others, though, like that triple fin blenny in the bottom left, the bottom left, were very shy. So you had to very carefully sort of sneak around them to make sure you could get a nice view before they snuck away. I really couldn't help but notice from an artistic perspective that the colors underwater were way more intense and incredible than I could have imagined. There's just, as you can see from these corals, it's just like a Dr. Seuss book. It's just amazing. So there's the amount of fish in the Galapagos is just unreal. There are these huge, huge schools of fish at times. I just wanted to show you a little bit of what the experience of being in some of these schools of fish was like. They would just surround you. And it was almost like being an alien in another world. I felt totally out of my element. These huge fish just everywhere. All right, so now I'm going to move on to the invertebrates. So the invertebrates are, they're not as well documented and as well studied as the charismatic bigger animals. So there's still tons of species that have yet even to be discovered in the Galapagos. But this one here, the Sally Lightfoot crab, is like, the flagship species, the flagship invertebrate species. It's so colorful. You can see it looks like a primary color palette. And they get their name from the fact that they look as though they're just walking over the water. Such incredible colors. And then here's just a couple other invertebrates. I have the juvenile Sally Lightfoot crab, which looks like a fireball, sea urchins, hermit crabs, starfish everywhere, so much variety. In terms of reptiles, interestingly are the dominant group of terrestrial animals. It's not mammals. Most places it's mammals, but because, like I said, that limiting factor of swim, fly, or hitch ride, there are way more reptiles than mammals. And this green tortoise is one of the coolest ones you can find within the water. They're just these big, slow animals. Wait, here we go. They're so slow, they just sort of float by you. And you can pretty much just sort of swim right up to them because they just are too slow to get away from you. Unfortunately, sea turtles are one of these species that was negatively affected by the invasive rats. A lot of animals eat the eggs of things like turtles in the Galapagos, but the scales were really tipped when the rats came in. They wreak havoc on sea turtle eggs. And now only about 1 in 1,000 sea turtles makes it to maturity, which is not a good number. All right, so we're going to get to the Galapagos tortoise, which is, the symbol of the Galapagos Park. The islands are named for this animal. Each different island has a slightly different subspecies of tortoise. They're not sure if one day they could discover they are all a completely different species. And each tortoise has a slightly different shell pattern, which is how you can tell which island it's from. And unfortunately, because tortoises don't need to eat or drink a lot, back when sailors and whalers and pirates used to come through, they would actually take thousands of tortoises and stash them aboard their cargo ship, the cargo section of their ship, to save for food. They would just keep the tortoises alive until they needed to eat, then kill one of the tortoises and eat it. And because of this, the tortoise population plummeted until conservation efforts really kicked in. Now the tortoise is coming back, and because they can live to be 150 years old, there's a lot of chances to continue that upward population trend with the tortoises that now survive. So it's looking good for them. Here's an example of what a lot of tortoises look like together. It's just, here they are taking a mud bath. The marine iguana. If you've ever seen some of David Attenborough's animal specials, I highly recommend you go watch the one on marine iguanas after this. These are the only seagoing lizard. They eat algae. So they will swim out into the freezing cold water for up to 10 minutes. They can stay submerged, eating algae out of the water. But because they are cold-blooded, as all reptiles are, they need to quickly get back on land and heat themselves up again after that, so they don't just freeze to death. So you'll either see the iguanas out swimming in the water, which is really surreal to see, or you'll see them all in these big groups on land. Here's one swimming, which just to prove that they actually do it. There it goes, just swimming in the water, using that tail to get around, looking for some algae. And then here it is coming out of the water, which is quite a sight to behold. And then here they all are, sitting around, basking in the sun, restoring their body temperatures. And then the other hilarious thing they do is because they intake so much water with salt, they just spit it out their nostrils. So they'll be sitting there and just suddenly you'll just see spit and salt will come out of their nostrils. They're quite hilarious. All right, on to the birds, my favorite part. So everybody knows about boobies. They're hysterical birds. Booby actually means, it comes from Spanish bobo, which means fool. And the boobies definitely look like that. They've got this hysterical mating dance where they will walk around. I have a picture up in the upper right where they're sort of showing off their beautiful feet. The blue-footed booby here has those very iconic blue feet. The brighter the blue, the more flirtation power they have. They will do this hysterical dance where they, shove up their feet, point up their beaks to the sky, and then shove out their wings. And this is called sky pointing, and it's supposed to be very seductive to the lady blue-footed boobies. They're also very aerodynamic. Boobies have this amazing ability to just pinpoint prey under the water and then just plunge dive into the surf to get it. So the blue-footed booby is of the three boobies in the Galapagos, the blue-footed is the one that fishes closest to shore. So it's easy to watch them plunge dive like this. The second booby, the Nazca booby, is the biggest booby in the Galapagos. They fish just a little further out offshore. So you can kind of figure out which booby it is by how far offshore it is if you can't get the coloration on them. But the Nazca boobies here have a very interesting method of parenting. They will lay 2 eggs, but only let one of the chicks survive to adulthood. So the stronger one survives and the other one doesn't make it. But aside from that little bit of a rather masochistic parenting, they're actually very sweet. And you can see in the top left corner, they preen each other. There are these very intimate moments between the 2 parent birds where they would just gently, these very gentle little pokes and prods. And it's one of those things that makes you realize just how much birds can be like humans in their intimacy and their attachments with each other. This is the red-footed booby. It's got those awesome red feet. There are 2 morphs of red-footed boobies. There's the dark morph, which you can see on the right is that brownish color. And on the left, you can see a white morph, which obviously has those white feathers. They fish furthest out. They will only fish out over the ocean, so you will rarely ever see a red-footed booby fishing from the shores of the Galapagos. And they bring their catch back to hilarious little babies that look like this, which to me screams, "Look, I'm a hungry Muppet." So all the booby babies tend to look like this. I think they're absolutely hysterical. They just sort of sit in these shrubs around the islands where the boobies are nesting, screaming for food. And it's really hard not to want to pick them up and just shut that beak and then just sort of shove them in your arms because they're so cute and fluffy. All right, I'm going to talk about a couple endemic species that are good examples of birds that are, in a very precarious position because of climate change, like this lava gull. This is a bird that could very well be extinct if we are to experience any kind of sea rise. This is a bird that nests very close to the shore, so it's in a very precarious position if sea levels are to rise, this lava gull. And you can see it's perfectly adapted to the Galapagos. That color matches the kind of lava, that cooled lava behind it, so that it's an example of a bird that was completely made to live in here and it can't live anywhere else. So if we were to lose it here, there'd be no chance of having it. We have these swallowtail gulls, which are very unique gull. They have this beautiful red ring around their eyes, which scientists speculate actually help them fish at night. They are the only gull that fishes at night. They look for little squids, and then they have white chicks so that it's easier for them to figure out which chick is theirs when they bring the food back in the cover of darkness. They're the only gull that has white chicks, which is why scientists speculate that coloration is to help them feed their chicks in darkness. And they also, you can see them preening each other a lot, the parents, which I think is just really beautiful. These are some of my favorite birds in the Galapagos. These aren't completely unique to the Galapagos, but they are a huge impact on some of the other birds in the area. These are frigate birds. They are essentially sea pirates. They practice kleptoparasitism, which means that they will steal food from other birds rather heartlessly. Other birds have to feed their chicks. These sea pirates just swoop down, steal the fish, away they go. So there's 2 kinds, the magnificent frigate bird, which are more of a purple color, and the great frigate, which are more of a green color. And they have these fantastic throat pouches, which they inflate just part of the breeding process. So I just want to show you just how much of a rather a sea pirate kleptoparasites they are. So here's a baby frigate bird getting fed by its mother, and they even steal from their own children. Here they are trying to steal food from a swallowtail gull that we just saw. Here they are stealing food from a blue-footed booby. Yeah, they're just, look, I love this picture of them looking all just like epic gang going through the sky. It's rough out there. This is one of the birds that is most often preyed upon by the frigate birds. This is a tropic bird. Its scientific name is great, Phaeton aetherius. It's named after that Greek character Phaeton, who flew who flew the sun's chariot. The tropic bird has to pinpoint its route between ocean and sky exactly to stay away from those frigate birds. It has to, drive that route as carefully as Phaeton had to drive his sunny, fiery chariot. So this here is a flightless cormorant. I love this particular creature because it is a perfect example of evolution in the Galapagos. See those really dinky wings? Cormorants that live here in New York, they have wings that they use for flying. But as the name implies, these flightless cormorants no longer have that ability. They don't need that ability. Their vestigial wings are useless. See, there it is. The feathers barely even connect. All they need to do now is swim. And they have evolved that totally unique ability in the Galapagos because they just don't need to fly from place to place like cormorants here do. So amazing evolution right there. Everyone loves penguins. Interestingly enough, the Galapagos has a penguin. It's a rather tropical place, but this is the most northern penguin in the world. It is the only penguin that lives in the northern hemisphere. So you can actually see a penguin in the Galapagos. And this is another example of a species that would be very, very much in trouble with climate change. It lays its eggs in little holes in the rock. So if the sea level were to rise, and it would lose all of its nests and areas to nest. So what scientists are doing is they're trying to create artificial little crevices and higher rocks further from the shoreline to see if they can create substitutes in case, and when inevitably sea levels do rise. All right, so this is just to prove to you that there are some other animals in the Galapagos that are not endemic. We have brown pelicans here, down in Florida, down along the East Coast. But interestingly, this brown pelicans are an example of evolution happening in front of us. So the brown pelican that's in the Galapagos is currently a subspecies of pelican, meaning it's not its own full species, but it is a species that could very one day evolve to be its own species, just like these brown noddies, which we have in other parts of the world. But these brown noddies live in such a way with the pelicans that they develop behaviors and adaptations for this Galapagos specific encounters that may continue to help them evolve into their own species, separate species as well. And then again, you might recognize some of these birds here. We have our great blue herons right down the road in Larchmont, great egrets we have here, yellow crowned night herons we have here. Those are all birds that actually migrate from the mainland to the Galapagos. There is some migration, not much, but it does exist. These species might evolve into their own particular kind of great blue heron Galapagos style eventually. But there is one, and you can see the one that stands out as different in the bottom right. This lava heron is endemic, and you notice that it matches the color of the lava. It has evolved here in such a way to take advantage of the geology and the landscapes of the Galapagos. So it'll be interesting to see, we won't be around for it, but if in another million years, these other herons start to change and start to look different in such a way that they also blend into the environment of the Galapagos. All right, then there's one more bird that we have here. You can also see in the Galapagos, this little yellow warbler. You can see it right down wherever there's a little swamp or a little meadow around us. But you'll notice that it looks different in the Galapagos. It's developed its own patterning and plumage, even though it's the same bird. That's kind of cool. There are two predators in the Galapagos. There's the Galapagos hawk, which is the daytime predator. And then we have the Galapagos short-eared owl, which is the nighttime predator. Then here we have a couple of the species that Darwin was looking at when he was trying to figure out natural selection. There are 4 different kinds of mockingbirds in the Galapagos. Each island, or I guess a couple of them are on a couple different islands, but they're so similar you could barely tell the difference, except for slight different markings and slight differences in eating patterns. One of the mockingbirds, the Floriana mockingbird, only exists on one tiny island called Champion. There are only about 150 individuals, and this bird is, I would guess, would be the first big tragedy of climate change. If one, or even a typhoon or a big wave came up and engulfed the island, that bird could probably be wiped out in an instant. It's so precarious, it's unbelievable. We have Darwin's finches, of course. And if you can see from these pictures, like some of these finches are so similar that unless you know what island they're from, you might not actually be able to figure out what the bird is. Like I sometimes go through pictures where I look at the bird, I look at another bird, and I cannot tell what finch it is just because except for that slight variation in beak and in location, they're the same. All right, so the last bird I want to talk about is one of my favorites. And I put up the Rime of the Ancient Mariner to kind of just preface this bird. This is the waved albatross. A good south wind sprung up behind, the albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. And let me tell you, when I saw this albatross, I was taking picture after picture, and then I yelled at all my friends, I shot the albatross! It was really fun. So albatrosses are these pelagic birds that spend most of their lives at sea. This waved albatross is endemic to the Galapagos. And it only nests on the island of Hispaniola, where you can see here is this really rocky, craggy island. And albatrosses are famous for their longevity. They can live to be 60 years old, and they are monogamous birds that come back after flying out over the ocean every year to find their exact same partner. And then they will do this incredibly dorky dance, which I tried to illustrate here with these pictures, to renew their bond. So the albatross will go, wah, 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 wah. And then they'll do this bill clapping like this, wah, wah, and then they'll go, wah, and it's really hysterical. And then they make these little cute Muppet albatross chicks that are absolutely adorable and will one day grow up to roam the seas outside of Hispaniola, just as their parents do. Okay, so I just put up a little bit of my art just to show you how the Galapagos can be this incredibly inspiring place. The colors, the animals, it's like nothing like it on Earth. I highly encourage you to go watch some of David Attenborough, go do some more reading. There's tons of documentaries about this place. Just let it feed into your imagination and just imagine all the things that are yet to be seen in this wild, wild place. If you ever have any questions or anything, this is my contact info. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So if you have anything you want to ask, or please let's ask. And then I just want to say before I forget, I created a little brochure highlighting some of the coolest animals that we saw tonight, and I will drop that link in the chat box so you can download it, and then just have a little reminder and a souvenir of our virtual trip today. And then I think Paul said he would also email it to everyone on this list so that you can get it that way as well if you can't figure out how to download it from the chat. So now let me stop my screen share, and we can jump into some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina. That was great. We have one question in the chat. Do the seals and other animals have to evade killer whales and sharks?
That's a great question. So yes, there are a lot of sharks in the Galapagos. There's one night I looked over the edge of the boat and there was a enormous shark. I mean, just huge. There are hammerheads. It's just, yes, it's a dangerous place. I don't think killer whales come that far south, but there are other whale species. There are quite a few, actually. I think one of the biggest threats to these sea lions and the other marine animals are probably once they're adults, aside from human interaction, are definitely the sharks.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.